The derelict warship loomed ahead, drifting in the abyss like a forgotten corpse. Its massive hull bore the scars of long-forgotten battles, deep gashes from energy blasts, jagged holes where escape pods had once been. Ethan Vance adjusted the controls of his repair shuttle, his fingers steady despite the unease gnawing at his gut. The Salvation, as the ship had once been called, was supposed to be nothing more than an abandoned relic. Yet, as Ethan docked and stepped into the airlock, the silence felt wrong. Stale air rushed past him as the doors groaned open. The dim emergency lighting flickered, casting erratic shadows across the narrow corridors. Ethan's boots echoed against the cold metal floor, each step measured. He'd been sent here to assess the ship's salvageable tech, nothing more. But the moment he crossed the threshold, something in his gut told him this wasn't just a salvage job. His gloved fingers hovered over the scanner on his wrist. No heat signatures. No life signs. And yet, the feeling of being watched refused to leave him. He moved deeper, past shattered control panels and dangling wires. The ship was eerily intact, too intact. The Voran Syndicate, notorious for its illegal research, had owned this vessel before its disappearance. That alone made Ethan wary. If they'd left something behind, it was nothing good. Then he saw it. A containment chamber, large, reinforced, its glass fogged from years of neglect. Ethan's pulse ticked higher as he wiped a hand across the surface, revealing the curled figure inside. A woman. She was motionless, her body half-clad in torn fabric that once resembled a uniform. Restraints encased her wrists, ankles, and throat, sleek metal embedded with circuitry. Symbols he didn't recognize glowed faintly beneath her skin, pulsing in sync with the machine. A test subject. Ethan swore under his breath. He had no idea how long she'd been in there, but judging by the faded bruises on her arms and the haunting stillness of her form, she'd been forgotten, a discarded experiment left to rot in deep space. He glanced at the control panel. Power reserves were failing. If the chamber lost stability, she'd either suffocate or be trapped in stasis forever. His hand hesitated over the release mechanism. Damn it! Logic told him to leave. Report it. Let the authorities deal with whatever twisted nightmare the Vorans had locked away. But then she moved. A slow, weak shift of her fingers. A tremor in her breath. Ethan made his choice. With a sharp hiss, the pod's seal broke. Cold mist spilled into the air as the locks disengaged, and the woman slumped forward. Ethan caught her before she hit the floor, her body impossibly light in his arms. She inhaled sharply, the sound raw, as if her lungs were relearning how to function. Then golden eyes fluttered open, striking, luminous, filled with confusion and a flicker of something deeper. Fear. She jerked, struggling against him, her strength surprising despite her weakened state. Ethan loosened his grip but didn't let go. Hey, easy, he said, keeping his voice calm. You're safe. She stilled, but her gaze remained locked onto him, wary. Her throat worked as she tried to form words, but no sound came. Her fingers clenched weakly against his chest plate, testing the reality of his presence. Ethan exhaled. Can you understand me? She blinked, a slow, cautious movement. Then, faintly, she nodded. Good. Progress. Ethan eased her to the ground, one hand hovering in case she collapsed. She sat stiffly, her breathing uneven. Now that he could see her up close, he noted the intricate metallic veins trailing beneath her skin, a fusion of organic and synthetic. Foreign technology. Not just a prisoner. A creation. What's your name? He asked. She parted her lips but hesitated, her brow furrowing. Then, barely above a whisper, Sarah. Ethan nodded. All right, Sarah. We need to get out of here. Can you stand? She shifted her legs, wincing. The restraints had left raw marks on her wrists and ankles, her muscles likely atrophied from prolonged stasis. Yet she tried. Ethan moved to support her, but she tensed, instinctively recoiling. Mistrust. He understood that. Okay. No touching. Just take it slow. Sarah gritted her teeth and pushed herself upright, swaying but managing to stay on her feet. Her determination was evident, but so was the pain she tried to hide. Ethan's communicator crackled to life. "Vance, report. You find anything?" Captain Rourke's voice was sharp, impatient. Ethan glanced at Sarah, disheveled, bruised, bound in remnants of metal shackles. If the crew found her, she wouldn't be a person to them. She'd be evidence. A commodity. He made a decision. "Negative," Ethan said, keeping his tone neutral. "Nothing but scrap. I'm heading back." A pause. Then, "Copy that. Don't waste too much time." Ethan cut the comms and met Sarah's questioning gaze. "You're coming with me," he said. Her fingers twitched. "Why?" The word was hoarse, as if her voice had been in use for years. Ethan could have said because leaving you here means condemning you. Or because no one deserves to be treated like property. But instead, he simply said, "Because you deserve better than this." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him. Then, after a long silence, she gave the smallest nod. Ethan exhaled and gestured down the corridor. "Let's move." She took one slow step. Then another. And as the dim lights flickered overhead, Ethan knew he had just made a choice that would change everything. For both of them. The Salvation groaned beneath Ethan's feet as he navigated the ship's decaying halls. The air felt thick with age, the dim lighting casting shadows that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Sarah moved cautiously beside him, her steps hesitant but growing steadier. Despite her fragile condition, there was something about the way she carried herself, graceful, almost predatory in a way Ethan couldn't quite explain. He glanced at her, his breath catching slightly as her eyes flicked over to him, gold and intense, like something out of a dream. "You're quiet," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. Sarah's lips twitched, just enough for him to notice. Her eyes darted down the corridor, then back to him. "Not used to being free," she said, her voice raspy. "They never let me speak." Ethan's brow furrowed. "Who? The Vorans?" She nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "I was never supposed to be this." Her words were quiet, filled with a quiet sorrow that he couldn't ignore. The way she said it made Ethan realize that whatever had been done to her, it wasn't just physical. "You're not a thing, Sarah," he said firmly, his hand brushing against her arm, brief, but enough to let her know he meant it. "You're a person. And you deserve more than whatever they did to you." She stiffened at his touch but didn't pull away. For a moment, he thought she might speak again, but instead, she simply nodded, the barest hint of vulnerability flickering behind her golden eyes. They reached the shuttle bay in silence, where the distant hum of the engines could be heard. Ethan led her inside the cramped space, where his ship was docked. The Erebus was a far cry from the pristine vessels the Federation used, but it was his, clunky, reliable, and strong enough to get them out of here. Sarah's gaze swept over the ship, lingering on the worn control panels and the exposed wiring. She paused in front of one of the auxiliary engines, her fingers grazing the surface. "This ship," her voice trailed off, almost reverent. "What?" Ethan asked, feeling a hint of unease rise in his chest. "Old tech," she whispered, her voice low. "But it speaks to me. The ship, she knows me." Ethan blinked. The last thing he expected was for her to sound familiar with the ship. "You're a mechanic or something?" Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a second, her expression was unreadable. She didn't answer, turning her back to him. Instead, she moved toward the cockpit, her gaze never straying far from the controls. Ethan shook his head, pushing aside the rising suspicion that something wasn't right. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get out of here before those syndicate bastards realize we're gone." Sarah moved with a fluidity that unnerved him. She didn't sit down in the passenger seat but instead moved straight to the comms panel, her hands flying over the buttons with an expert precision he hadn't expected. "Hey, whoa, hold on," Ethan said, moving closer. "What are you doing?" Her eyes met his, this time holding no fear, only a sharp intensity that felt both foreign and familiar. "Sending a message." We can't just run. They'll find us. Ethan took a step back, alarm bells ringing in his head. What do you mean, they? Who are you really, Sarah? Her eyes softened for a moment, like a shutter falling over her expression. She didn't respond right away, but the atmosphere in the room thickened with unspoken truths. Ethan crossed his arms, narrowing his eyes. You're not just some prisoner. What are you? She stood, her posture tense, and for the first time since he'd found her, she let the walls come down just a fraction. I was a weapon. A prototype. She said the words quietly, as if admitting them to herself for the first time. A weapon. Ethan's stomach tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just some runaway test subject. She had been designed. Created. Sarah's voice trembled as she continued, her gaze turning to the stars outside the window. I wasn't supposed to feel. They. She stopped herself, shaking her head. No. The point is, I was never meant to be human. Then why? The Vorans had their reasons. She cut him off, her voice darkening. And now they'll stop at nothing to reclaim me. The room was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the soft hum of the ship's engines. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. She had no place in this world. No family. No ties. And yet, here she was, somehow more alive than anything he had ever encountered. Who are they to you, really? He asked, his voice softer now. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she set them on the comms panel. They created me, Ethan. But I never belonged to them. Not completely. There was more. He could feel it. But instead of pushing her, he let the silence stretch, offering her the space she needed. Her shoulders slumped, and her voice was barely audible when she spoke again. I don't want to go back. You won't have to. His response was immediate, decisive. Not if I have anything to say about it. The promise hung in the air between them like a fragile thread. A sudden, shrill alarm cut through the stillness, snapping Ethan to attention. The ship's exterior cameras flickered on, revealing an incoming fleet. Vorans, Sarah whispered, her eyes flashing with fear. They're already here. Ethan's hands flew to the controls. His fingers brushed over the weapons system, preparing for a fight, but a small voice inside reminded him that escape was their only chance. He couldn't afford to get tangled in a battle he wasn't ready for. Hold on, he muttered, pressing a button to engage the engines. The Erebus lurched forward, and the ship tore away from the docking bay, the vast emptiness of space opening up before them. But as he glanced back at Sarah, he couldn't ignore the feeling that they were both running towards something they didn't understand and away from something far worse. The Erebus shuddered violently as it tore through the vastness of space, its old engines groaning under the strain of an escape it wasn't designed for. Ethan's fingers danced across the controls, his breath steady but heart racing. He'd survived worse, but nothing like this. Nothing that involved her. Sarah remained silent in the co-pilot's seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the viewport as the stars streaked past them. Her profile was bathed in the cold, flickering light, and despite the steady hum of the ship's engines, Ethan could feel the heavy silence between them. You don't have to be so quiet, he said, trying to break the tension that hung thickly in the air. His voice sounded almost too loud in the confined space. You know I don't bite. Sarah's lips quirked upward slightly, but her eyes never left the view. I'm not afraid of you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. No, she said firmly. But I am afraid of them. The weight of her words sank in. The Vorans. He had barely processed the implications of what she'd said earlier, but now, with the adrenaline fading and the hum of the engines filling the silence, he felt the gravity of her situation. What are they to you? Ethan pressed, his voice softer now. He moved to the side, leaning against the bulkhead. You said they created you? Sarah's body tensed at his words, her shoulders stiffening as if bracing herself for a blow. I wasn't created, she murmured, her voice low, almost fragile. I was remade. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wanted to press further, but something in her tone warned him not to push too hard. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back, giving her space but never fully looking away. Remade, he repeated, his voice quiet. How? She didn't look at him, her fingers curling into fists in her lap. They took parts of me, parts one didn't even know were there. They used my DNA, manipulated it. I was a product, a weapon, but they didn't understand that I. She cut herself off, taking a sharp breath. I can feel. They never counted on that. Ethan felt the weight of her words, a sudden understanding flashing through him. Whatever the Vorans had done to her, it wasn't just physical. She wasn't just some experiment. She was a living being, one who had been twisted into something she never wanted to be. He took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not a weapon, Sarah. You're a person. I see that. Her head snapped to him, her golden eyes alight with a mix of disbelief and something softer, something buried beneath the walls she'd built around herself. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, Ethan said, meeting her gaze head-on. Enough to know that I won't let anyone take you back to them. Sarah stared at him, her expression unreadable, before finally nodding once. I don't want to go back. The air between them felt thick, charged. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and Ethan realized just how close they had become. He was still trying to wrap his head around her story, but the more she spoke, the more her pain became real to him. The warning alarms sounded then, sharp and insistent, snapping them both back to the immediate danger. Voran ships, Ethan muttered under his breath, his eyes darting across the blinking consoles. The sensors were picking up 6 ships rapidly closing in on their position. Can you outrun them? Sarah asked, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. Ethan's fingers moved quickly, locking the course into the Erebus's navigational systems. I'll try. But these old engines were never meant for this kind of speed. She didn't respond, instead turning her gaze back to the control panel, her fingers brushing over it almost as if she could feel the ship's pulse beneath her fingertips. He glanced over at her, confusion bubbling up. What are you? Before he could finish, the ship lurched forward, and the viewport exploded with streaking light as they jumped into hyperspace. The sudden acceleration threw him back into his seat, but he didn't have time to savor the brief feeling of safety. The Vorans would be coming for them, no matter how fast they were. What did you do? Ethan breathed, looking over at her, his pulse still racing from the jump. Sarah met his gaze, her face pale but resolute. I hacked into the ship's systems. Took a shortcut. We won't be visible to them for a while. Ethan blinked in surprise. You can do that? Her lips curled into a half-smile. More than you think. He leaned forward, the tension lifting slightly. You're full of surprises. But the smile didn't reach her eyes. Don't get used to it, she said, her voice dark. The Vorans will catch up. They always do. The room grew cold again, the brief warmth from their shared moment disappearing like vapor. Sarah turned away, her gaze fixing on the stars ahead. Ethan watched her, knowing she was hiding something more than she was letting on. But for now, it didn't matter. They were safe, at least for the moment. A sudden thought hit him. You said you don't want to go back. Why? His voice was hesitant now, almost unsure. You don't have to tell me, but... She cut him off with a soft exhale, her fingers still resting lightly on the controls. Because they won't stop, Ethan. They'll use me until I break. Or worse. Her words hung in the air like a silent threat. They'll turn me into something I'm not. And I'll never forgive myself for that. Ethan's heart clenched in understanding. Then I won't let them have you. His voice was firm now, resolute, the promise of protection in his tone. Sarah didn't respond, but he saw the slight tension in her shoulders relax, just for a moment. As the ship sped through the silent void, the uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed larger than ever. And yet, with her beside him, Ethan found himself questioning everything he'd ever known about his own world, and the strange, dangerous pull of this woman who had already become so much more than just a stranger in need of rescue. The steady hum of the Erebus was a reminder that they were not yet safe. Despite the hyperspace jump, the threat of the Vorans still loomed like an unshakable shadow. Ethan kept his fingers steady on the controls, eyes flicking to the readouts as they raced through the darkness. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. Sarah sat beside him, her figure silhouetted against the soft blue glow of the ship's dashboard. Her face was unreadable, but her tension was palpable, a quiet storm swirling beneath her composed exterior. "We can't outrun them forever," she said, her voice steady but tight. "You know that, right?" Ethan exhaled sharply, not bothering to glance at her. "I know." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was crushing. He didn't know what he was doing. Every decision felt like it could be their last. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a mechanic, until she had walked into his life, and everything had changed. "Then what's the plan?" Sarah's tone was sharper now, insistent. He turned to her, her golden eyes burning through the dark. "I'm still working on it." His mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "This ship isn't exactly built for combat, and I sure as hell don't have a battalion of trained soldiers to call on." Sarah's jaw clenched. "That's what I'm afraid of." Her words were a punch to the gut, and for the first time, Ethan felt a ripple of doubt spread through him. Could he really protect her? Could he protect them both from the endless storm that was the Vorans? The silence between them thickened, growing heavier with each passing moment. The only sound was the occasional beep of the console, a reminder that the ship was still moving, but not fast enough. "Why did you help me?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice low. "You barely know me." "I'm not." She stopped herself, the words dying in her throat. Ethan frowned, his eyes flickering to her as his mind worked through the question. "You didn't ask for this. You're not some experiment to be abandoned or discarded. You're a person. And..." He paused, the words catching on something deep inside him. "And I don't leave people behind." A flicker of something soft passed across her features, something that almost resembled relief, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "What if I'm dangerous? What if I..." "You're not a weapon," Ethan cut in, his voice firm. "Not anymore." Her lips parted as if to argue, but then she closed them, looking away. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she whispered, almost to herself. Ethan swallowed. Her pain was tangible now, raw and unfiltered. He wanted to reach out, but he didn't know how. Words weren't enough. The ship jolted suddenly, breaking the fragile moment between them. The proximity alarms blared to life, the sound sharp and demanding. "Brace yourself!" Ethan barked, his hands flying to the control panel. The viewport ahead flickered as a new set of coordinates popped up on the screen. Voran ships were closing in. Sarah's head snapped up, eyes wide. "They've found us," she said, the horror in her voice unmistakable. The Erebus was now within their grasp. Ethan's fingers flew across the console, inputting commands with a desperate urgency. The ship wasn't built for this. It wasn't fast enough. "You said you could hack their systems?" He shot at her, a plan forming quickly in his mind. "Do it. Now." Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking to him, then back to the control panel. "What are you planning?" "I'm going to make them think we're somewhere else," Ethan replied, his voice sharp, his pulse quickening. "But I need you to." "I know," she interrupted, and in that instant, the intensity in her eyes shifted. The coolness that usually dominated her expression gave way to a fierce determination. "I can do this." Ethan watched as her fingers flew across the panel with the precision of someone who'd spent years navigating complex systems. Her face was a mask of concentration, eyes scanning every readout as she bypassed security protocols and rerouted the ship's signal. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he realized just how far her skills went. She was more than just a survivor. She was a force in her own right. The ship jerked again, this time with more force, and the comms crackled to life. A deep, guttural voice rang out in an unfamiliar language. He didn't need to understand the words to know what it meant. They were too close now. Too close to escape. Sarah's fingers hesitated for a heartbeat, and for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of doubt in her expression. I can't. You can't, he urged, his voice low but filled with conviction. You're not alone in this. I'm not leaving you. The words seemed to break through the barrier she'd erected around herself. Sarah's eyes met his, and for a moment, the universe outside of them seemed to cease. There was only her, only him. And then, without another word, her hands moved with renewed purpose, the flow of commands running faster than Ethan could track. He could feel the change, the pull of the system as it shifted. The comms went silent. For a moment, Ethan's heart stopped, the tension so thick in the air he could taste it. Had they succeeded? Sarah exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging in relief. I've scrambled their signals. They'll think we've jumped to another sector. The ship jerked again, and the console chimed, just a blip in the vast expanse of space, but to Ethan, it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. They were safe, for now. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, turning to Sarah with a smile. I think we're good. She didn't return his smile, but there was a softness to her eyes that hadn't been there before. You were right. Ethan raised an eyebrow. About what? She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something more than just survival. You're not like the others, she said quietly. You don't just see me as a weapon. He shook his head, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I told you. You're not a weapon. Not anymore. Sarah's eyes held his for a long moment before she finally nodded, her expression softening just enough to make Ethan feel like he'd won something. They weren't out of danger. But maybe, just maybe, they were on the same side now. For the first time since she'd walked into his life, Ethan felt a flicker of hope.